Our first speaker of our session 3 about spirit communications and manifestations. Peter Hayes' talk is entitled Publishing the Word of the Spirits. Remember, take notes for the next Q&A session. That is going to be right after our coffee break.
Peter Hayes is a very active member of the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey, where he's one of the teaching staff for the education department. He has done lectures on Spiritism in Miami, Atlanta, the tri-state area, and weekly live web study meetings via the United States Spiritist Council. Recently, he was involved with the editing staff on the new edition of the Spirits book published by the U.S. Spiritist Council. He has also helped edit the very first publication by the Spiritist group Love and Light, the English edition of Diary of a Counselor by Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro, plus the second book, A Shipwrecked Life, written in English by an American spirit, Hercules, and channeled by the American medium, Jennifer Arlota. So let's welcome Peter Hayes.
Afternoon. Publishing the Word of the Spirits was inspired by two articles from the Spiritist Review. The first one is Contradictions in the Language of the Spirits, which was published in August of 1858. And the second article was Should We Publish Everything That the Spirits Say, which came out about a year and a half later in November of 1859. Now, Allan Kardec was asked a question, but before I get to that, these two articles were published just after the time of the Spiritist book. And because of that, I think this question was put to Allan Kardec, which is, should we publish everything that the spirits say? That is, in mediumistic meetings, if messages are psychographed, should those messages be published? After all, the Spirit's book has phenomenal information from the spirit world. But before I tell you what Kardec said in response, I'd like to put that question to all of you. Please, through a show of hands, how many of you think we should publish everything that the spirits say? Okay, and how many of you think we should not publish everything that the spirits say? Well, you're all just too smart, what can I say? Allan Kardec said, would it be good to publish everything that people say and think? I mean, could you imagine? I'm sure all of us could take comfort that everything we say and think to our families, loved ones, when we're impatient or maybe a little angry, that all of that could be published? No. The question I would say is this. I'm going to rephrase it. Rather than should we publish everything that the spirits say, the question could be, what does it mean that we should not publish everything that the spirits say? Well, because Kardec dispenses with this question pretty quickly in this second article of the Spiritist Review. So, Kardec says the following: communications depend on the elevation and character of the spirits. In other words, responses could be frivolous, gross, trivial, obscene, and so forth. Or they could be very sublime, insightful, intelligent, and very moving. The responses can be all over the place. So the next question then is, meanwhile, we have an issue with contradictions in language of the spirits. Now, this is in response to the first article, Contradictions in the Language of the Spirits, where there can be all kinds of opinions from spirits on the same subject, and people were wondering, what should we do with this? After all, we want to believe in spirits, and we support this, but nevertheless, what do we do when we're getting different opinions? Or the other issue that can come up is you have skeptics who are looking for ammunition to discredit Spiritism, and so they can say, you see, we get all this contradictory information, what are we supposed to think? Well, Kardec encouraged us to say, look, at first glance this could be an issue, but we should be thinking a little bit like scientists. In other words, it's normal to have facts that seem to establish or seem to contradict the established rules, and we should not be upset when this happens. Furthermore, the spirits warned that this was going to happen. There we go. And the third is that the key is to observe all the facts, including the contradictions, and then establish what the rules might be. One rule would be this: every effect that reveals an act of free will is proof that there is intelligence. I'm sure many of you know this, but I'm going to say something that's a little obvious, but here it goes. First of all, free will, all spirits have free will, so do we, and of course all spirits have intelligence, and so do we. The combination of free will and intelligence is so powerful that the number of communications that could be generated is almost infinite. Meanwhile, Kardec, going back to an observation and a fact, Kardec realized something rather early on in the process of putting together the Spiritist doctrine. And he writes about this in the book, What is Spiritism? And I'm going to read it to you. Spirits, being nothing more than human souls, were endowed with neither supreme knowledge nor supreme wisdom, that their knowledge was limited to the degree of their evolution, and that their opinions had only value as personal opinions. I recognized this truth at the start, and it enabled me to avoid the grave mistake of believing that spirits were infallible. And it also kept me from formulating premature theories based on the opinion of only one or a few of them. Now, this has a few different implications. The premise of the Spiritist doctrine is that it's based on multiple sources, not one. That makes the information more reliable, more credible, and it's decentralized. So we don't have the single teachings of one individual. There's no guru in Spiritism and so forth. But also, the question could be asked, why does this need to be emphasized? Okay, spirits are just like people. Well, sometimes people get very impressed by the spirit world. There's an assumption that perhaps because information comes from the spirit world, that it's more important. But there can be a bit of a trap, as it were, in which sometimes one is a little too preoccupied with the phenomena of Spiritism, and rather the content of Spiritism is more important. Now, I'm going to go back to talking about the essential point that is made in the two articles in the Spiritist Review. And they both conclude the same thing, that the quality of the communications depends upon the evolution of the spirit. And so I'm going to spend a moment and go through questions 100 to 113 from the Spirit's book, which talks about spirit hierarchy. This is going to be brief because this subject is so vast that it could take quite a while to get through. But spirits are basically classified upon how advanced they are and the qualities that they have and whether or not they have any faults. And there are three general orders of classification. The first one would be imperfect spirits, that's the lowest order. The second order would be good spirits. And the third would be pure spirits. Those are spirits of the first order. Imperfect spirits are more controlled by matter. By matter, I mean also passions as well as material desires. And they tend to do what is wrong. They tend to be arrogant. They tend to have a lot of pride and so forth. Good spirits generally try to do the right thing. They're trying to improve. And their ability to balance intellect and morality is better, certainly, than imperfect spirits. You can have situations with imperfect spirits where they have a great deal of intelligence, but not a lot of morality. A doctor, for instance, could have a great deal of skill and knowledge, but may be greedy or doesn't particularly care what he or she does to his or her patients in order to, for instance, get more money. So that would be an example of really misusing intelligence. But good spirits are trying to balance that out. And also good spirits have a great deal of wisdom, and they're certainly capable of being charitable. But But yet, good spirits have qualities of those imperfect spirits. They can sometimes show signs of habits and quirks and so forth that will come out. And all of this can affect the nature of communication. So when people are trying to decide what to do with communications from spirits, once again, who or what type of spirit are we dealing with here? Now, pure spirits are free of matter, and generally speaking, pure spirits do not need to come back here on earth unless there's a really important mission for them to accomplish. They are more able, certainly able to balance high intellect and high morality. And compared to good spirits and imperfect spirits, pure spirits seem perfect. Even though I should emphasize here that in all of these three categories, these three separate orders, these are just guidelines. No one is necessarily exactly within one particular order. A good spirit can have certain qualities of imperfect spirits and maybe even certainly show some signs of being qualities of a pure spirit, but they can't necessarily sustain that. So there's a lot of flexibility and a range of evolution between these categories for spirits. Within imperfect spirits alone, there's several different categories of, quote, imperfect spirit. But all of this goes to show a couple of things. I'm going to go back because I made one little mistake. Pure spirits can communicate with a mediumistic group when they choose to. But the thing to keep in mind here is this is not going to happen all the time. Most of the time, mediumistic groups are going to be visited by imperfect spirits. Why? Because they need help. They're the ones that need help. And it would be presumptuous of individuals in mediumistic groups to assume that they could just summon imperfect spirits whenever they feel like it. So they have to be, it all depends on the intentions of the group, and it depends upon the intentions of why they would want to have this particular spirit come to them. And this, again, underscores that every effect that reveals an act of free will is proof that such acts are caused by intelligence. Now, the two articles from the Spiritist Review, Contradictions in the Language of the Spirits and Should We Publish Everything That the Spirits Say, both of them came out before the Medium's book, but nevertheless, they're talking about subjects that can be referenced in the Medium's book. And I'm going to spend just a moment talking about one of them. This is from Chapter 10, Part 2. There are four main categories of communications. First would be crude communications. The second would be frivolous communications. The third would be serious communications. And the fourth would be instructive communications. Crude communications are coming from spirits of the lowest order. They can certainly be trivial. These can be comments that are ignoble, that is, of a base quality. They can be obscene, insolent, arrogant, malevolent, and they can even be impious or disrespectful of authority of God and so forth. Frivolous communications are not as malevolent and nasty as crude communications, but even so, they're more mocking and mischievous. These are spirits that like to make jokes. And generally speaking, they're more of a waste of time. The American intellectual Susan Sontag, back in the 1980s, I believe it was, said in commenting about our era, "We seem to be entering a period in which there's almost an inability to take much of anything seriously." Now, if that's true, it implies that there is a lot of fear out there. And one of the things Spiritism emphasizes is that we need to know ourselves. And one reason to be frivolous and turn everything into a joke is to try and hide or avoid confronting something that could be very painful. I'm going to shift gears here for a little bit by showing you an example of a type of communication that can happen. This is from the book Diary of a Counselor, written by Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro. And he writes about his experiences being in a mediumistic group, and he had all kinds of contact with different kinds of spirits. And he tells one instance where he had a medium who he really regarded as being perfect. I mean, she was always reliable. Whenever she was receiving the spirit, she was always in control. And so he got to the point where he felt very, very trusting of her, to the point that he began to relax the rather strict rules that they had in place for scrutinizing communications. Well, one day a spirit shows up, and this spirit is desperately sick. So they did what they normally do. Passes were administered. They did prayers to Jesus, and they did further counseling. And this went on for a while, and then all of a sudden, the spirit just burst out laughing and said, "Didn't I say someday I'd fool you? I caught you two fools at once. Where is the perfect medium? You're all suckers. I'm in perfect health." Well, they did some work with this spirit and tried to get it to see that it should not have behaved this way. And the medium felt badly. She did see something in the spirit's paraspirit that made it look as though the spirit could be sick. But nevertheless, it was a lesson well learned. Now this, in terms of communication, this is one that starts off serious in tone, but is really frivolous underneath. Now and it also reveals, or I should say Kardec emphasizes in the second article in the Spiritist Review, that spirits will reveal themselves by their own language, and we should therefore not blindly accept everything that comes from the spirit world. I'm going to go back to the 4 categories of communications with serious communications. These are communications that are not crude, they're not frivolous, and they offer information that is useful. It may only be of interest to certain individuals, but nevertheless it's considered a serious communication. But that does not mean these kinds of communications don't have errors. After all, spirit could have a great deal of knowledge about a subject, but it doesn't know everything. The difference is that this spirit has good intentions and is trying to genuinely give a communication that is worthwhile. And the 4th category are instructive communications. These are ones that, in terms of thinking about publishing communications from spirits, they would be more of this category. Look at the gospel, for instance. It's full of communications from spirits that are certainly worthy of being published and are very wise and instructive and inspiring. These, of course, depend upon how elevated the spirit is and how, whether or not how free it is of material needs and desires and so forth. And the way to take full advantage of these types of communications, if you're getting more than one of them, would be to make sure that the content is consistent, which means that the content has to be scrutinized very carefully. And over time, it makes that process much easier to ensure that there's a high intellectual moral value in these communications. Spiritist communications need to be carefully scrutinized. So in mediumistic meetings, it is important that not one person look at those communications or 2, but a whole group of people. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it's a system of checks and balances that really needs to be in place. There's a little danger that Kardec raises in should we publish everything that the spirits say, in that sometimes communications come across as serious, and yet when you look at the content of those communications, you realize that the ideas are really absurd and wrong-headed, and so forth. I'm going to add to that also you could have communications that seem very serious and have good intentions, but there's an agenda going on. And so here's another example from Diary of a Counselor. They had one experience where a spirit visited the mediumistic group and lavished all kinds of praise on this group. And the spirit wanted to lead them in the prayer. And the spirit said, "Although everyone here is with Christ and receives his strength, courage, and vigor, I see fatigue from daily hard work in some of your faces. I talk to your mentor, and he allows the ones who are feeling taxed to be absent for a few days or weeks for a much-needed recuperation. God fulfills needs." Now, isn't this nice? This spirit comes in, it's concerned about the group, it tells the group that you're doing a wonderful job, you guys have been phenomenal, but yeah, some of you are looking a little tired. Why don't you take some time off? Take a month off, 2 months, It's fine. I talked to your mentor spirit, okay? It's fine. And of course he does, I'm being a little sarcastic, but nevertheless, he probably did it in a very even-handed tone. How many of you who are involved in mediumistic activity of all have strict rules at your center about attendance? Yes? Is it okay to miss, if you're part of a mediumistic group that took time to develop, is it okay to miss several sessions, maybe take a month off? Well, not without consequence, of course. It can affect the group, and also, if you do that, you can't just come right back and pick up where you left off. So, Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro, the author of this book, Diary of a Counselor, saw through this immediately, starting with all these excessive praises that he was getting from the Spirit. So, he decided to use a seen medium. And what did the medium see? That this Spirit had brought the prayer written on a piece of paper and just read it. In other words, the intention of this Spirit was really just to weaken and undermine the mediumistic group. This points to another concern, which is from the gospel. This kind of communication, which has to do with false prophets. False prophets aren't found only among human beings. You'll find them in even greater numbers in the spirit realm, where some spirits are full of egotism. These spirits pose as being all love and compassion, but under this guise they try to sow confusion and hold back the spiritual emancipation of humanity. Once again, it's not that all communications are going to be like this by any means, but nevertheless, there are a number of spirits that may sound really nice and seem to have a lot of good intentions, and maybe they even believe what they're saying. But nevertheless, a false prophet is not necessarily someone who's going around trying to act as if he's some spiritual leader. False prophet can just be somebody who's wearing a mask, period. I'm going to begin to wind this up with the end of the first article I mentioned from the Spiritist Review, Contradictions in the Language of the Spirits, offers a nice summary at the end of it. I'm going to mention some of these. This can be thought of in terms of what to consider when trying to handle communications from spirits that seem to be contradictory, but also it's a way of thinking about whether or not such communications, or what kind of communication should be published and so forth. The first is that how good a communication, of course, depends upon the ignorance or wisdom of the spirit, which we've talked about. The second could be the trickery of the spirits. Sometimes you have spirits that like to put on names. So if a spirit shows up in your mediumistic meeting and says, I'm Mahatma Gandhi, or I'm Jesus, or I'm Martin Luther King, that's a bit of a red flag. The mediumistic group that may be receiving such a spirit the members of it would have to ask themselves, why are we so lucky that Gandhi is showing up to our mediumistic group? Jesus, I don't think so. Okay. It would be wonderful, but Jesus doesn't need to do that. And so one has to keep, those kinds of, if that is going on, those things can certainly have to be realized. The third, which we haven't talked about really, is that sometimes mediums, probably through a lack of training, may alter or distort communication. One example could be animism, traumatic animism, imaginative animism, or impressive animism. That is, if you have a spirit that comes into a mediumistic meeting and has had a traumatic experience, and the medium has had the same kind of traumatic experience, the medium may be upset in some way enough that this can have an effect on the quality of the communication. And this is could be similar to imaginative, in which a medium may be blending his or her imagination a little too much with the communication coming from the spirit. Now, mediums need to allow the communication to happen, but they also need to be in control, and they are, especially if a spirit wants to curse or is really unruly. But at the same time, they need to not mix their own imagination into what the spirit is saying. And then finally, you may have an example of a medium that gets a little too impressed with a particular type of spirit. Let's say you have a spirit that was in the American Revolution, and the medium is a huge, huge history buff, just loves the American Revolution. So a spirit comes in, I was involved in the American Revolution, and the spirit says, I know some things about the founding fathers and all that stuff. And the medium may get very impressed with this, and that may affect the communication as well. All of this, of course, can be handled very simply. The mediums need to be trained. I heard this said, and this comment always stuck with me. There's two types of mediums, trained mediums and untrained mediums. And this takes a while, of course. Fourth, another thing that could happen is if you have a counselor that's trying a little too hard to get a spirit to give an answer to a specific question. Maybe the spirit, for very good reasons, does not want to give an answer to this question. And what could happen is that spirit leaves and an inferior spirit takes its place and is more than happy to give an answer, and that answer may be very misleading, conflicting, erroneous, and so forth. And the fifth one, which I'm going to conclude with on this, is that the human language has its limits. And so sometimes a communication can seem confusing or contradictory because there are limitations to the human language. The Spirit's book mentions more than once that our language is limited, our capacity to understand certain concepts about the spirit world can be limited. And spirits generally are more interested in ideas and concepts and not so much about specific language. That's a generalization, of course. Not all spirits, but many probably do. And yet we humans sometimes attach a lot of meaning to specific words and specific phrases and so forth. And so we have to have some flexibility in this when looking at a communication and deciding what is it really trying to say to us. At the end of the day, Kardec has some very simple, straightforward advice. Many difficulties can be overcome through long and persistent study. In other words, we just need to study the doctrine, which takes a while, and it takes a lot of persistence and effort, but that's what we need to do. And if we do that, chances are we're going to find an answer that we're looking for. And this type of advice is also echoed by Luis Gonzaga Pinheiro in Diary of a Counselor. He says, in all the study groups that I have participated in, I never ceased to put Kardec's magnificent books in first place. Other colleagues based their studies on vast academic literature available on complex theories, particular explanations, and pompous names. I looked for Kardec, and there it was, logical, simple, truthful explanations. Some people were surprised. It's more than likely that we're not going to remember everything about what's in the doctrine, right? Because there's so much to learn. But if we're in a situation where we're dealing with communications from a spirit, we're trying to decide what to do here, we just need to spend some time and look it up in the doctrine. And chances are we're going to find what we're looking for. Thank you.